tweet from Chris Mellon. He just shared a redacted and annotated screenshot of an exchange with a senior government official from around 2020. This is also on his Substack. This official discussed access to a U.S. alien technology recovery and exploitation program. Let that sink in for a second. He also mentioned making progress in accessing a classified program related to a UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 1950s. He also referred to the program's management, security controls, and the recovery process for landed or crashed UAPs. He also mentioned a highly classified memo from the 1950s by a Secretary of the Air Force as still being in effect to maintain secrecy on this matter. That's all new info. The government may deny all day long, but this information tells another story.
Chris Mellon just dropped a private message between himself and a senior U.S. government official who seemingly just flat out confirmed a crash retrieval program in the retrieval of a UAP in Arizona in the 1950s. So here is what Chris Mellon dropped, are these texts. Here we go. Blank and I are making huge progress getting into the CR program, the crash retrieval program. He plans to meet with you at some point. The blank would be slack-jawed if they found out what we now know. Blank from Christopher Mellon. Senior USG official says, right now, we haven't gone that far back. We're dealing with a recovered UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 1950s. We're vacuuming up info as a redacted gets read in. We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of the crash retrieval. We also know who recovers landed or crashed UAPs under what authorities. We also know that a still highly classified memo by a Secretary of the Air Force in the 50s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs. We also know the SES-2, who's the Air Force gatekeeper. Now, the Kingman, Arizona UFO crash is a very significant crash, and we're going to get into why that is. There seems to have been at least one live being recovered from that crash that assisted the UFO control group in developing and reverse engineering alien technology.
The story of the Kingman crash first surfaced publicly in 1973, 5 years before Jesse Marcel famously told Stanton Freeman he was a part of the Roswell cover-up in order to pose with fake wreckage comprised of balsa wood and aluminum foil while the crash disc was secretly whisked away. In 1973, UFO researcher Raymond Fowler revealed shocking statements made and sworn into affidavit by a Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineer and USAF project engineer on Operation Upshot Knothole under the pseudonym Fritz Warner. And before we get into this story, what is this weird name Upshot Knothole? This was a series of 11 nuclear test shots conducted in early 1953 at the Nevada Proving Ground, orchestrated by none other than the Atomic Energy Commission. The objective of this project was to utilize tactical nuclear weapons to ready the US military for atomic combat. These tests even oversaw nuclear payload shot out of artillery cannons. An estimated 18 to 21,000 DoD personnel participated in this program in 1953. Anyways, back to Werner. Let's hear his story. Werner stated to Fowler he was an engineer on USAF contract with the AEC for Operation Upshot Knothole. His job was to measure blast effects on various types of buildings constructed for the tests. On May 20th, 1953, Fitz spent most of the day at Frenchman Flat. Dr. Ed Dahl telephoned Werner that evening he would be doing a special job the following day. Joined by 15 other AEC specialists, Werner reported to Indian Springs Air Force Base. There, he was put on a plane to Phoenix with all of his valuables left in the custody of the military police and eventually placed on a bus with blacked out windows. During the 4-hour ride, an Air Force colonel told the personnel a super secret Air Force vehicle had crashed, and these specialists were sent in to investigate their specialty and theirs only. When he finally got off the bus, Fitz observed two agonizingly bright spotlights centered on a crashed object surrounded by guards. In Fitz's own words, quote, "The object was oval and looked like two deep saucers, one inverted upon the other. It was about 30 feet in diameter with convex surfaces, top and bottom. These surfaces were about 20 feet in diameter. Part of the object had sunk into the ground. It was constructed of a dull silver metal-like brushed aluminum. The metal was darker where the saucered lips formed a rim, around which were what looked like slots. A curved open hatch door was located on the leading end and was vertically lowered. There was a light coming from inside, but it could have been installed by the Air Force," end quote. Werner's duty was to attempt to determine the angle from which the object impacted into the sand and how fast the vehicle was moving with forward and vertical velocities at the time. The craft had sunk roughly 20 inches into the sand and featured no landing gear and, shockingly, no damage. No marks or dents on the surface, not even scratches. Over time, Fitz estimated the craft had been traveling at roughly 1,200 miles per hour. And amazingly, Fitz claimed to glance at a guarded pitch tent where lied the body of a dead pilot. It appeared to be a 4-foot-tall humanoid biologic with dark brown skin and a silvery metallic-looking suit. This excerpt of the affidavit is from Fowler's book, Casebook of a UFO Investigator, under the section Crash Retrievals of the Third Kind. Quote, "I, Fritz Werner, do solemnly swear that during a special assignment with the U.S. Air Force on May 21, 1953, I assisted in the investigation of a crashed unknown object in the vicinity of Kingman, Arizona. The object was constructed of an unfamiliar metal, which resembled brushed aluminum. It had impacted 20 inches into the sand without any sign of structural damage. It was oval and about 30 feet in diameter. An entranceway hatch had been vertically lowered and opened. It was about 3.5 feet high and 1.5 feet wide. I was able to talk briefly with someone on the team who did get a look inside only briefly. He saw 2 swivel seats, an oval cabin, and a lot of instrumentation and display. A tent pitched near the object sheltered the dead remains of the only occupant of the craft. It was about 4 feet tall, dark brown complexion, and had 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, and a small round mouth. It was clothed in a silvery metallic suit and wore a skull cap of the same type of material. It wore no face covering or helmet. I certify that the above statement is true, affixing my signature to this document on this day of June 7, 1973. Signed, Fitz Werner, witnessed by Raymond E. Fowler." Fitz's identity was later on revealed and confirmed by Fowler as one Arthur Stancil Jr. Now, quite often his name is spelled Stancil, which is incorrect in a confusion. It's Stansel. But anyway, Stancil's background and credentials can be directly confirmed. Stancil began his career at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, at that time Wright-Patterson Airfield, serving as a USAF aircraft engineer test mechanical engineer for the Air Material Command after honorably taking part in the D-Day landings of World War II. Arthur was additionally working at the Nevada Proving Grounds on May of 1953 when the crash occurred, specifically studying the effects of atomic blast on structures, as Fitz stated, and this was during Operation Upshot Knothole. To add even more credibility to Stancil, the engineer also worked on aspects of the Manhattan Project and for 16 years on the Apollo program. Let's start to break down and analyze the context of some of Stancil's claims. Remember first, his story came out in 1973, and 1978 was when Marcel revealed the truth of the Roswell cover-up. We can definitively rule out this accomplished engineer was just riding the coattail of the Roswell crash. Within Stancil's testimony, he mentions the night before viewing the wreckage, receiving a phone call to report by one Dr. Ed Dahl, who was in fact a project director and physicist for Operation Upshot Knothole at the Nevada test site. Unfortunately, Dahl has long since passed and no statements were ever made by him about this alleged crash retrieval. However, there is another man with possibly even deeper connections to UFO crash retrieval. During his time working as an engineer at Wright Field from 1949 to 1960, Stansel worked in what was known as the Air Material Command Installation Division, within the Office of Special Studies headed by Dr. Erich Wang. Dr. Wang was an Austrian-born graduate of the Vienna Technical Institute. In 1949, Wang became the director of the Department of Special Studies at Wright-Patterson, where he worked with scientists from the Office of Naval Research, and Dr. Vannevar Bush, who has some connections to the UFO phenomena, and others from the Research and Development Board. Dr. Wang relocated his research from Wright Field to Kirkland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, around the time of Operation Upshot Knothole. Tracking down record of Wang has proven to be extremely challenging. However, direct proof can be found of his role in the Department of Special Studies in the actual DoD Operation Upshot Knothole unclassified document. The importance of determining Wang's credentials cannot be understated, seen as Wang is a figure in UFO lore suspected of having deep ties to reverse engineering and crash retrievals around this time. More investigating needs to be done here, but Wang allegedly led reverse engineering efforts under Kissinger. Wang was known to be a close associate of Victor Schauerberger, an Operation Paperclip scientist who developed concepts for flying discs for the Nazis. Wang, of course, is not the focus of today's video, neither is Dahl, but Stansel serving under both Wang and Dahl to an extent during the 1953 crash is of note. 3 months after the alleged Arizona crash in 1953, the USAF issued Regulation 200-2, which required all UFO reporting to be sent to USAF Intelligence and not Project Blue Book, the official USG investigation group at the time. This directly stovepiped UFO reporting, leading to fewer credible reports making their way to Congress and the American people, fueling the growing UFO stigma. While Regulation 200-2 most definitely relates to the Robertson panel, it is quite plausible to suspect that restricting UFO reporting was to keep a tight lid on previous and future crash retrievals like the Kingman, Arizona crash and possibly Roswell. Also, a key piece here is the AEC's connection to Upshot Knothole and the Kingman crash. As my community can probably recite by heart, the 1954 Atomic Energy Agreement has been used to misclassify UFO material as, quote, trans-classified foreign nuclear material to avoid declassification and restrict information to need-to-know basis. The 2024 NDAA Schumer legislation directly states the 54 Atomic Energy Act has been used by DoD and legacy programs to protect UFO program records and materials. And while we're at it, let's not forget the testimony of Lieutenant Robert Jacobs and Robert Salas of Malmstrom Air Force Base. Shockingly, Stansel was not the only credible whistleblower to make claims about the Kingman crash. Meet the under-the-radar alleged UFO reverse engineering whistleblower Bill Uhouse. Uhouse was featured on Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project in October of 2000 and made some astounding claims. Uhouse was a former mechanical engineer and 14-year USMC vet retired at the rank of captain, with a history of flight testing of exotic experimental aircraft at Wright-Pat. While working for a defense contractor and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Uhouse claimed to work as a pilot and design engineer for a flying disc simulator. The simulator, according to Bill, became operational in 63 to 64 and was based off a recovered disc retrieval. And you can probably guess the crash he names.
As I watched the reason why I'm saying this is because the simulator wasn't actually functional until around 1958, where the simulator was actually operable. The simulator that they used, or the craft that they used to build, which is a 30-meter one, was the one that crashed in Arizona, Kingman, Arizona, back in 53 or 52. I think it was 53.
According to Uhouse, the craft was taken to Area 51/the Groom Lake facility, and the dead pilots were taken to Los Alamos, part of the AEC. Gotta mention, Uhouse also makes numerous other statements, including touching on a recovered extraterrestrial humanoid codenamed J-Rod. However,
and here's some additional information.
The craft was 30 feet in diameter, 14 feet tall. That's what you see in the drawing that I've put together here.
Yeah.
It had a series of slots going around the outer circumference of the disc. There was a small entry hatch on the lower portion of the rim, a brushed aluminum surface. It was found to be buried about 20 inches into the sand at about a 15-degree angle of attack. There were 4 humanoid figures found with the craft when the military got there. Now, according to Harry Drew, there was one that was in front of the other 3, who apparently was the quote-unquote commander. And just to go a little bit forward in this story, there was a communication between the high-level military brass and this particular commander, and he said, quote-unquote, "We will go with you only under one condition, that you do not separate us." And so that was the communication that was made between members of the retrieval team and also these beings that were, if you look at a 5'10" man, they came up to his shoulder, according to Harry Drew.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
there's no description in these illustrations, unless I'm missing it, of these beings.
No.
Do we have any? Okay.
Only from the testimony from Arthur Stanzel. He said that the eyes were slightly further apart than ours, and they had a pointed chin. That's the description I've got in the report.
But not, so therefore not what we would call the quintessential grays, or even like the description of the beings from the Aztec crash.
More humanoid looking.
Yeah.
More humanoid, but not your typical gray.
Now, of course, Bill Uhouse, engineer Bill Uhouse, is famous for interacting with a being named J-Rod that may have come from the Kingman crash.
There were 4 aliens aboard that thing, and those aliens went to Los Alamos, and they put certain people in there with them, people that were astrophysicists, just general scientists, to ask them questions. The way the story was told to me was there was only one of them that would talk to any of these scientists that they put in the lab with them. Only one of the aliens. The rest wouldn't talk to anybody or, even have a conversation with them. First they thought, it was all, ESP or, what do I want to say?
telepathy?
Mental telepathy. But most of that is kind of a joke to me because they actually speak. Maybe not like we do, but they actually speak and can converse. The difference between this aircraft or this disc and other discs that they had looked at was that it was much simpler design. These particular capacitors, they last for 30 minutes, so you could get in there and actually work the controls and do what you had to get the aircraft or get the simulator, the disc to operate. Okay. Actually, when it was operable, it would lift off the ball about a certain amount of there was a dimension there that we had. Upside down, there's no upside down, like in a regular aircraft.
Bill Uhouse actually got to meet one of these beings and work with him, J-Rod, the being J-Rod. And J-Rod was helping them develop this training device that Bill Uhouse worked on. And Don Phillips, a Skunkworks engineer, talked about how his fellow engineers, possibly like Bill Uhouse, were working on this training device. So Bill Uhouse isn't alone in talking about this. So if the Kingman UFO crash is now confirmed by Chris Mellon, that also might go a long way to corroborating Bill Uhouse's testimony about a live being or multiple live beings working with the control group back in the early 50s or back in the 50s to develop this alien technology to develop their own UFOs. This could be the genesis for the control group getting their own UFOs and working with the beings. Here's what he had to say about J. Rod and his interactions with the engineers and what they were working on.
Basically, it was only engineering advice or science advice, where the top mathematicians and stuff couldn't figure some of this stuff out. So we would take it, and then, you know, we'd have to, with each design, you know, there's a requirement for calculations. And we'd have to prove by calculations, you know, that this thing's going to operate. No different than anything else we do. And sometimes you get into a spot where you try, and even if you use the formulas to come up with this thing that they provide you, it wouldn't work. And that's where he'd come in, you know, to tell him to look at this and see what we did wrong.